I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. In February, a magistrate judge ruled that police could use all reasonable force necessary to draw the blood of Catherine Amato, who was refusing to submit to any sobriety tests or provide samples of her breath or blood after being pulled over, with the presiding judge finding that a San Antonio police officer had probable cause to believe she was driving while intoxicated on Northwest Loop 410, the second time in less than 2 years that the prominent local businesswoman had been charged with that offense. But on April 24th, less than 2 months after Amato's blood was forcibly taken, outgoing Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood's office dismissed the DWI charge, and Amato is now seeking to have all records of the case destroyed with an expunction hearing set for next month. I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News Metro columnist Brian Chasnoff to discuss his research into what happened that day in February, as well as the story behind how that DWI charge came to be dismissed. So, Brian, great to have you here on In-Depth for the first time. There's a lot to discuss. Let's get right down to it. Who is Catherine Amato?
Catherine Amato she's a prominent local businesswoman. She owns about 55 local subway franchises in the area. So you could describe her as a restaurateur. Her husband is Charlie Amato, who is the chairman and co-founder of the Southwest Business Corporation, and he's also a San Antonio Spurs shareholder. So prominent businesswoman.
Absolutely. And so, of course, anytime something like this happens to prominent members of the community, it can become part of, the local news coverage for a television station, radio station, or, of course, a newspaper like the San Antonio Express News. But it goes further than that, and that's what we're going to start talking about now. Tell me about Miss Amato's previous drunk driving experience with the police. As I mentioned at the top of our discussion, this isn't the first time something like this has happened.
Right. There were 2 arrests that I found in the court records. The first was in 2016. And this was, she was pulled over on suspicion of driving while intoxicated, ultimately arrested. She had refused, she submitted to field sobriety test on that stop. She was unable to recite the alphabet. She was, not steady on her feet. And then she refused to submit blood or breath samples. And, as is the case in Bexar County, the police officer was able to file an affidavit for a search warrant listing the reasons that her blood should be drawn, and then a magistrate judge signed that search warrant and her blood was drawn. This was for the first arrest. That charge was knocked down by the DA's office to obstruction of a highway, which is a lesser charge. She was put on deferred adjudication, which is a form of probation, and she was dismissed from probation early, and that was that. Less than 2 years later, she was pulled over again. This was in February of this year. And this time, she refused to submit even to the field sobriety tests. The officer had listed the reasons that he pulled her over and arrested her in the police report and also in another affidavit for a search warrant to draw her blood. And those reasons included she was swerving on the highway. She actually almost collided with the officer, according to the police report. She swerved into the lane on the highway that caused another vehicle to move over to avoid getting hit. When the officer pulled her over, he noticed that she had bloodshot, glassy eyes, and she was insisting she had had nothing to drink at that point. And ultimately, after the officer arrested her, he found vodka bottles in her car and her purse. Three bottles of vodka. One was full, one was empty, one was half empty in her purse. So her blood again was forcibly drawn. And less than 2 months after that, however, the DA's office dismissed the DWI charge. And on the paperwork that covers the dismissal, the assistant DA noted that the charge was dismissed because there was no probable cause for arrest. And to me, that was the crux of the story that really piqued my curiosity, is how could the DA have found no probable cause for her arrest when the police officer found so much probable cause that the magistrate judge authorized the forcible, blood draw.
Yeah, it's almost like a who's on first situation. It doesn't make sense when you try to put all the pieces together. We're going to get back to that in a moment because that's really why we're discussing this case. And this is all part of a write-up that you have that is appearing now on expressnews.com that you can find more information. But I want to get back to this first run-in with police that Miss Amato had, because that was when her blood was also drawn. So this is the second time that this has happened to this prominent businesswoman. What are your thoughts on how common that is? Is that something that happens in this situation, or is that something that's more rare?
Yeah, that's a policy. That is a policy of the district attorney's office that was started before Nico LaHood became DA. I believe he just continued it. If somebody refuses to provide a breath or a blood sample, then a police officer can, file an affidavit requesting a judge's signature to authorize the blood draw. So in other words, you can't get away with just refusing to provide these samples in Bexar County. If you refuse, a nurse is going to draw your blood one way or the other.
And then what's your impression on, does that actually happen quite often, or perhaps do people know that would happen? So maybe they just go ahead and stop the battle?
I mean, I don't have the statistics on how many people refuse to do it, so I couldn't answer that question. But I would be comfortable saying that for those who do refuse, virtually all of them then are receive forcible blood draws, as long as the magistrate judge finds probable cause for the officer to suspect that person was driving while intoxicated.
And this might also be a difficult question, but I'm going to throw it out there and see what you have to say. So this charge, the first time around, was reduced to obstruction of a highway. Do you have any indication of how common that is? Is that something that happens from time to time, or is that something where maybe if you have a very good legal defense, that might be an occurrence that would happen?
Well, I think a good legal defense is always important to even know that that's an option. My understanding is that is an option on your first DWI. If it's your first one, then you can get that knocked down in a plea deal. And in this case, Mrs. Amato struck a plea deal with the prosecutors. She paid $800. She submitted to, I believe, some courses, and was placed on deferred adjudication in exchange for this lesser charge of obstruction of a highway. My understanding is once that happens, if you get pulled over again, then you can't get the same sort of a deal.
But as it was in this case, the second time around, the charges were actually dismissed. And I assume that's when this story kind of landed on your radar, if you will. And so that's my question now. At what time was this something that you began researching into? Obviously, the incident happened back in February, and it was last month when the charges were dropped. Have you been working on this story for the past month? At what time did work commence on this research?
Well, as you might know, Chance, I have 3 deadlines a week. I write a regular column for the newspaper, and this only came to my attention this week. So I've really, it was a matter of going to the courthouse, pulling the files, speaking to whomever I could reach on the phone about this, and I really had about 3 days to put this together. And I should probably note that I reached out to Mrs. Amato herself. Every attorney of hers that I could find, as well as the DA's office. And I got little response back, very little.
And so let's go into what you did find out then. We mentioned earlier the idea of like a strong legal defense and how that might help you. It's no surprise, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to most people living in the United States, because I think this is just common knowledge that, the more money you have and perhaps the more prominence you have in a community, perhaps the easier it might be to beat charges, or to have charges brought down to a lesser charge, or just, have the charges dropped altogether, as is the case with this second DWI occurrence from Miss Amato. Did you find anything in your research and all the calls and all the checking that you did that might indicate that was perhaps something that was happening here? Because I asked this question because if you or I had been in a situation like this, do you think it might be safe to say we wouldn't have had the charges dropped, either because we wouldn't have been able to hire a very good lawyer, let alone a legal team, or we wouldn't have had such prominence in the community to perhaps have, any type of pressure applied. And obviously these are my words that I'm throwing out there. So I'm interested in what you might have found that might trigger any of the ideas that I just threw out to might actually have happened in this case. And once again, these are all my words. So I'm wondering what you have to say.
Well, sure. I found no evidence of any sort of quid pro quo in this situation where Mrs. Amato received leniency in exchange for something specific. But I can tell you that for the second DWI that she got in February, she did hire an attorney, and that attorney filed a flurry of motions in the court, and the charge was dismissed very quickly relative to how most of these cases proceed through the system. And I think that's an important point, just the swiftness of the situation. I did get some people on the phone. I spoke with Bexar County Clerk Jerry Rickoff, who I liked his turn of phrase. He called this a rogue event, meaning it was highly unusual. He said this is like a rocket. A normal DWI takes like a year to move through the system. And he even expounded on that. He said every person in the criminal justice system is supposed to be treated as fairly as every other person. But this was a rogue event. I spoke with an individual named Frank Davis. He's a local attorney who had served actually as an expunction attorney for the Texas Department of Public Safety for 15 years. And I called him, of course, because Mrs. Amato, after the charge was dismissed, she began she began the process of getting the charge expunged, as you noted. And the expunction hearing, or an expunction hearing, is scheduled for next month. And that is also indicates a very fast track for this case. And Mr. Davis reiterated what the county clerk said, which is this is all happening very fast. So on top of the dismissal and the possible expunction, just the speed with which this DWI case is moving through the system is a red flag.
So as you mentioned, you didn't find any evidence of, quid pro quo, anything like that, but you just did mention the speed, the alarming speed. I think it would be safe to say that all of this is happening. So what does that mean? If you're a regular San Antonian listening to this podcast right now, reading your story online or in the newspaper, and you see this, what is the takeaway from this for someone in that situation who doesn't have the money for a great legal defense, doesn't have the prominence in the community like Miss Amato, and to be fair, several other people, business owners, whatever they might be in the San Antonio community?
Well, I'll just quote Jerry Rickoff again. He said, "Lady Justice isn't necessarily blind." Of course, that's a metaphor. There's actually a statue in front of the courthouse of Lady Justice wearing a blindfold. And ironically, outgoing Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood often cited that in his re-election campaign, that Lady Justice is blind, meaning that she metes out justice equally to all. And Rickoff's more cynical statement is that Lady Justice isn't necessarily blind, meaning sometimes she peeks through that blindfold to take a look at exactly who's being charged with this crime.
And then I want to give you, Brian, a few moments to add anything that we haven't yet discussed on this topic. But my final question would be, we've discussed that expunction hearing that's coming up. So for Catherine Amato, what's next for this continuing mission of hers now to have these charges not only dismissed, which has already happened, but expunged from her record?
Well, I would have loved to have asked her attorney that question. Her attorney is Rolando Ramos with the Ramos and Del Cueto law firm, which happens to be the law firm that LaHood worked out before he became district attorney.
Oh, really? Wow.
However, Mr. Ramos did not return my call, or my message requesting comment. So that aspect of it, I can only go off what I see in the file, which is just that she is seeking an expunction, and it's scheduled for a hearing next month.
And then, so once again, I guess a clerical question, the expunction means it's just completely wiped from the record.
Correct. Once that goes through, no one will be able to find any record of the second DWI. Of course, now, it's in the newspaper, so that sort of, nullifies that attempt.
Exactly. So yeah, reporting like from someone like yourself, this podcast interview that we're doing now. And once again, if you'd like more details, we've covered a lot of ground here, but if you'd like more details, go to expressnews.com and look for that story that's coming out today. So Brian, once again, it's been great to have you on the program here for the first time. Hope to have you back. And yeah, thanks for insight into this story. Like once again, you've already mentioned there's no trail of any type of wrongdoing here, but I think it's safe to say it's alarming with everything that you've told me to note how fast this happened, and especially because this wasn't the first time that this specific prominent woman in the San Antonio community had this type of charge, this type of instance. It played out very differently the first time, and now could possibly in the near future be completely expunged from her record.
Yeah, and I think the reason I think that this was an important story to report. I mean, obviously, this is this is a difficult story for Mrs. Amato, who, by the way, I believe I reached on the phone and hung up on me. But this charge of driving while intoxicated is, as I probably don't need to tell anybody, is potentially a very dangerous behavior. There drinking and driving fatalities happen all the time. And, the criminal justice system is set up to punish those who, commit this dangerous crime. And, the penalties are there for a reason. And if a charge like this is going to be dismissed, there needs to be a good reason for it. And the DA's office has, at my deadline, did not get back to me to explain why this charge was dismissed.
Once again, San Antonio Express News Metro columnist Brian Chasnoff, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And a big thanks to San Antonio Express News Metro columnist Brian Chasnoff for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, our weekly interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.